Alright, in our new chapter, we are going to be talking about classification or taxonomy. And this is basically how organisms are put into categories or groups. So there are about 8 million known species of organisms, and that's only about 5% of what has ever lived, because remember, we have a lot of organisms that are extinct. Not to mention that there's organisms that we still haven't discovered in places like the deep ocean or the rainforest. There are organisms that we find that we didn't even know existed. So one of the things that we've tried to do is arrange these organisms, try to put them in groups based on their similarities, what they have in common with each other. And so this is also called taxonomy. And what taxonomists are specifically scientists that identify and name organisms and place them into these different groups. So why do we do this? Well, for one thing, we want to have accurate names of organisms, and we want to prevent misnomers such as, for example, the fact that starfish and the jellyfish aren't fish, right? So the names are misleading. So this way we have like a universal naming convention that everybody uses. We usually use Latin or Greek names, and the names are usually descriptive somehow of the organism. And so this way, everybody, all scientists are sort of on the same page, and there's one universal method of grouping the organisms and giving them all names. So in different languages, just to show you this, all of these people are calling this a different thing, but if we all give it a scientific name, now everybody's calling Memphitis memphitis. Everybody knows that name because that's the scientific name for skunk, and that's universally accepted, so it wouldn't matter where you went, everyone would be calling it the same thing. A local example of this is if you've heard the term puma, jaguar, or panther. A lot of people think those are three different animals. They're not. It's the same animal that different people in different regions give different names. So by giving it one scientific name, we all are on the same page using the same language. So originally Aristotle was the first taxonomist. He was very interested in plants and animals. He basically had two kingdoms, plants and animals, which makes sense. If it moved, it was an animal. If it stayed still, it was a plant. And he put all these organisms sort of into categories based on where they lived. And so he's kind of considered the very first taxonomist. Now, after him, there was another guy, John Ray. He was the first to use Latin names, but his names were extremely lengthy, and so his system was never really overly accepted. Even though it was very descriptive, it just wasn't really useful. And so that brings us to Carolus Linnaeus, and Linnaeus is actually considered the father of taxonomy. He's the first one. He organized them by their structure, and then he came up with a naming system, which we still use today, where every single organism gets a two-word name. And so Linnaeus, like I said, he is considered sort of the father of modern taxonomy. He developed our current system, and his two-name system is called Binomial Nomenclature. So literally that translates to, bi means two, nomial means name, and nomenclature means a system, so it's a two-name system. So every organism gets a two-word name, and that's going to be the genus and the species of the organism. So we classify these organisms into levels, and the last two levels are the genus and the species, and so those are going to actually become the scientific name of the organism. Now there's certain rules for this. In binomial nomenclature, it's the genus species name. They're typically Latin or Greek names, and they describe the organism. In print, like in a book, it's going to be put in italics. But if you're going to write it, you're going to underline it. That's the way you are going to do it. The genus is always capitalized, just the first letter of the genus, I should say. The species is not capitalized, and then the entire thing is underlined. So this is actually, somebody pointed out in class, not done correctly because they did not underline it. And so this is apparently the American robin, which is a pretty bird, and Turdus migratorius is its scientific name. So our scientific name is Homo Sapiens. So we would write it like this, Homo Sapiens, and then we underline it. Notice how the genus is capitalized, the species is lowercase, and we basically named ourselves, Homo comes from humanoid or human-like, hominid, And sapiens means wise, so we named ourselves wise humans. You may have heard of Homo habilis, which stands for handyman. So he's human-like, and he was the first one to use tools. Or Homo erectus, which is the first ones that walked upright. So our names kind of describe our different organisms. Here's another example. So here are 3 bears, so to speak. And you might be asked, which are most closely related? Well, if you look at their scientific names, if they're in the same genus, then they would be more closely related to each other. So Ursus maritimus, which is our polar bear, and Ursus arctos, which is the grizzly bear, would be more closely related, and they're actually more closely evolutionarily related as well. Our classification system is based on the same evidence we use in evolution, like homologous structures, comparing DNA, the comparative anatomy, comparative biochemistry, comparative embryology, same things we use in fossils, of course. For evolution, we use to classify organisms as well. Now, here are our levels. So it's domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. The broadest, meaning the most general level, is domain. There are only 3 domains. So all those millions of organisms fit into just 3 domains. But as we go down this list, we get more and more specific. And the more levels 2 organisms have in common, the more closely related we would consider them. So if they're in the same domain and kingdom, they're more closely related than if they were just in the same domain. For example, actually, I could give you an example here. So I could say, hey, how about we classify a dog, a plant, and an amoeba. So the dog and the plant and the amoeba would all be in the same domain, which we're going to talk about, called eukarya. But then they'd be in 3 different kingdoms, because the dog would be in the kingdom animal, plant would be in the kingdom plant, and the amoeba would be in the kingdom protist. Now, what if I added to this mix a bird and a worm? Well, the bird and the worm would both be in the same kingdom as us, right? And the dog. They would be all in the same kingdom. So the dog, the bird, and the worm would be more closely related because they would be in the same domain and the same kingdom than the dog related to, say, the plant. Now, if I go to phylum, and in plants this is called division, it's the same thing though. If I go to phylum, it turns out dogs and birds are in the same phylum. They're in the phylum Chordata. But worms are in a phylum called Annelid. So that would mean that dogs are more closely related to birds than to worms because dogs have the domain, the kingdom, and the phylum in common. Now, a cat would actually be more closely related to a dog than a bird is because it's in the same domain, kingdom, phylum, and class because the dog and the cat are both mammals and the bird is an aves. So you see how this works. So the further we go down this list, we get more and more and more specific, and the more levels 2 things have in common, working from the top down, the more closely related we would say they are. The most specific is species, and to be in the same species, they must be able to mate and make fertile offspring together. So a poodle and a chihuahua are the same species because they're both dogs, they mate and they can breed together, but a dog and a wolf are actually not the same species because they do not normally come together and breed and make fertile offspring. Wolves live in the wild, dogs are domesticated. So depending on if they typically will mate with one another, and it can be a behavioral thing, just if they won't mate because behaviorally they don't recognize one another as being potential mates, they would be considered separate species. Okay, and this is just explaining that you don't just come up with these names. You know, it has to be approved. There's an international code. There's an International Zoological Congress that names the organisms, and that way we don't have names that are duplicated. Taxon is basically one category where related organisms are put. Taxa is plural. And there's always this hierarchy, which we just talked about, starting at domain, the most general, and then getting more and more specific. And then remember these last 2 very specific ones, this is where we're going to get our scientific name. Now, why do we have domains? Just a little quick background. So back in the 1700s, there was just 2 kingdoms, plants and animals, which makes sense because they didn't have microscopes, they didn't know about microorganisms, So, you could just see it. If it grew from the ground, it was a plant, and if it moved, it was an animal. But in the 1800s, they added Protista. These were those microscopic organisms like amoeba, paramecium, because we had microscopes that we could see those. But then, when we got to the 1950s, we realized, for one thing, plants and fungi both grow out of the ground like mushrooms do, but mushrooms are totally different from plants. They have a different cell structure, they're not photosynthetic, so they needed their own kingdom. And it's not just mushrooms. Fungi include all kinds of things, which we'll talk about in another chapter. And we also included Monera. This is your prokaryotic bacteria, which we didn't know about back in the 1700s because the microscopes wouldn't allow us to see them. But once we had better microscopes, we knew that protists have a nucleus, bacteria don't. So they became a kingdom. And then in the 1990s, they split Monera, which is the bacterial kingdom, into two groups, Archaebacteria and Eubacteria. And when they did that, it was like, well, now we're up to 7 kingdoms. We kind of need a level above that. And so that's when they came up with domain. So this is, again, just showing you how we get more and more specific as we go. So all of those things are in the same kingdom, animal. But when we get to the phylum Chordata, the C star's out, right? So he doesn't have as much in common. And now we get down to class Mammal, which are the ones that have fur and give milk to their young, and that knocks out the snake because he's a reptile. So now these are more closely related. Now we're going to get even more related. Carnivora, which is an order. Well, the squirrel doesn't belong to that order. He belongs to probably rodent. He's probably a rodent. And then we get to the family Ursidae. Now we're only talking about bears, so the fox is out. And then this is the genus Ursus, and then it's cut off at the bottom, but this is one single species, Ursus arctos. So that gives you an idea of the different, the way that we classify these organisms and how these levels get more and more specific as we go. Now, one way to remember this, kind of cute way to remember this, Dear Kevin, please come over for good soup. So that's going to give you domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So if you can remember that cute little saying, and remember that the D at the top is your most general level, the domain, and soup down here at the bottom is going to be species, which is our most specific, it should help you. All right, checkpoint questions, and we'll end it here. So which two are more closely related? Two in the same family, phylum, order, or class. So you literally go down the list. We know that domain is the most general, then kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So the furthest down this list would be family. And if they're in the same family, by the way, we would assume that they're in the same domain, kingdom, phylum, class, and order. Everything above that level should also be the same if they're in the same family. You can't be in the same family if you're not in the same order, class, phylum, kingdom, and domain. All right, last one. Which of these is more closely related? So notice how these both have blanca, but if you know blanca means white, this could be, the white some kind of bird, and this could be the white some kind of reptile. So we need to start with the genus name. If the genus name is the same, then we could look at the species name after. So the ones that are more closely related would be B, Circa blanca and Circa negra. All right, and this is just showing an example of humans and how we are classified. So we are in the domain Eukarya, means our cells have nuclei, eukaryotic cells. We are in the kingdom Animalia. We are multi-celled, we move, we ingest our food. These are all kingdoms of examples of characteristics of the animal kingdom. Phylum Chordata has to do with that we have a nerve cord and a dorsal rod, which becomes our backbone in essence. We are mammals, which gives us that we have hair and mammary glands. We are in the order called primate, which also includes monkeys, chimps, apes. Family Hominidae, we are the only living organisms in this family. We're in a family all our own. All other organisms in the family Hominidae are extinct, like Homo habilis and Homo erectus, etc. Genus Homo, large brain, tool use, like I said. And species Sapiens, remember Homo Sapiens, us in particular, it actually translates to wise humans. So that kind of gives you an introduction, and next time we're going to talk about in more detail the 3 domains and the different kingdoms and what general characteristics they have.